You ever heard someone quote half a Bible verse out of context? Ever read some crazy Bible claim on social media followed by a proof text without exegesis? Here on Proof Text Flops, we call out this nonsense for what it is. My name is Hudson Smelly, and I'm going to give my elevator speech version of why that verse doesn't mean what so many people think it means. Today we're looking at John chapter 6 and verse 44, the poster child for bad proof texting, which reads as follows: "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day." The proof texters argue that no one comes to Jesus unless the Father efficaciously and irresistibly drags them to Jesus. But here's what the verse really means and why. As always, context is critical, and the lexical meanings of words are critical. And the sloppy proof texting of John 6:44 illustrates in spades what happens when context is ignored and made-up definitions are given to words. Let's start with the word our English translations typically present as draw. According to the Greek lexicon BDAG, the Greek verb helkuo can refer to physically moving an object or person with a pulling motion. That is its most common meaning, in fact. But it can also be used in a non-physical sense and be translated as attract or entice or some similar verbiage. Because no one claims that John 6:44 speaks of physically dragging a person to Jesus, we have to think about this idea of a non-physical drawing or attracting. For this purpose, we first consider its usage in John chapter 12 verse 32, where Jesus said that if I am lifted up from the earth, I will draw all peoples to myself. This was clearly a reference to his crucifixion. And the idea here is not physical movement of all peoples to Jesus. And of course, not everyone becomes a Christian, and so this is not a coercive action. A meaning like attract or entice fits the passage. The gospel message attracts or entices people to faith in Jesus. We can also look at the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where our Greek verb occurs in several contexts that do not involve physical movement. For example, in the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, chapter 1 and verse 4, Shulamit says to her lover, "Draw me away," which is a non-coercive enticing or wooing by her lover. Psalm chapter 10 verse 1 refers to a wicked man that is like a lion in his den waiting to catch a poor man, and I'm quoting here, when he draws him into his net. In this metaphor, it is enticing the poor into a trap that is at issue. In Hosea chapter 11 and verse 4, God is the one doing the drawing, and God says, "I drew them with gentle cords, with bands of love." Here we have God doing the drawing, and the sense of the word is enticing or attracting or wooing specifically by the means of love and not coercion. Likewise, we have in Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 3, once again God does the drawing, "As I have loved you with an everlasting love, therefore with loving kindness I have drawn you." Again, God does the drawing by displaying love. And in Josephus's famous history book, Antiquities, chapter 15 and section 27, our Greek verb is translated as entice when Josephus writes, "His design in doing so was to entice Antony into lewd pleasures with them," using the word entice. Now, let's look at our context. In John chapter 6, verse 35, Jesus claimed to be the bread of life, and he says, "He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst." But speaking to certain persons in the crowd, Jesus added, "But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe." In chapter 6, verse 40, we read, "This is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up the last day." In chapter 6, verses 41 and 42, however, we see a Jewish response of rejection. As we've already would have seen if we read through the entirety of John 6, many in the crowd had actually witnessed the feeding of the 5,000 and followed Jesus to his next destination to see another sign or get another meal. But we have Jesus trying to get through to them that he's the true bread, the manna from heaven that gives eternal life. Many in the crowd, however, reject these words that Jesus gave about himself. This causes Jesus to say to these rejectors, "Do not murmur among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day." Now, as we've seen, when this verb helkuo is used of something other than physical movement, it always has this idea of attracting, enticing, or you might say wooing. So we must ask, how from the text does God do this attracting, enticing, or wooing? And does this kind of drawing always result in someone coming to Jesus in faith? Let's read Jesus' own explanation in verse 45. It's written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught of God. Note that it is not that some, but all. Here in John 6:45, just as it was all in John 12:32. So it is God's teaching that does the attracting, enticing, or wooing here. Jesus then adds, therefore everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. This is not a hard verse. Those that come to Jesus must hear God's instruction and actually learn from it, which presumes that they are believing what God has said in his instruction. The reader of John's Gospel would no doubt think back to the prior chapter and its focus on the many witnesses that God provided, including John the Baptist, the actual works or signs that Jesus did in his earthly ministry. Beginning in chapter 5, verse 37, we read that the Father testified about Jesus. Then in 539, the Old Testament scriptures testified about Jesus. And all of these witnesses in chapter 5 culminate at the beginning of chapter 6 with the feeding of the 5,000, where once again we find God testifying about Jesus through this mighty work. Not everyone in class learned the lesson. The one that made the breads and loaves from nothing is the promised Christ, the true bread from heaven. All of this testimony draws people to Jesus. It attracts, it entices, and it woos people to Jesus, but it doesn't drag anybody, force anybody, coerce anybody. If you reject the instruction that Jesus is the Christ, the bread of life, despite all these many witnesses, all the testimony of God, all the instruction of God, and you only come to Jesus apart from all of that because perhaps you wanted to see another sign or have some more fishes and loaves, you will not have eternal life. That's what our verse is about. My Christian friends, let's always do the hard work of exegeting passages in context, with an eye on the structure of the book we're studying, the flow of the author's argument, and what the words that most of us are reading in translation actually mean. Let's not fall for proof text flops.